The corticospinal tract, also known as the lateral corticospinal tract, or pyramidal tract, is a neural pathway that carries motor information downwards from the brain through the spinal cord to eventually reach the muscles of our body below. The corticospinal tract is responsible for mediating most voluntary movements of the body. In this video, we're going to give you an easy way to remember the corticospinal tract, its functions, and its anatomical pathway, so you'll be sure to nail questions about this topic on your exams. We're headed to the deep for this one, where we've stumbled across a coral-infested spine of some whale or something. Yep, just look at that coral growth all over the spine here. By the way, the coral spine here should remind you of the corticospinal tract. Get it? Coral spine for cortical spinal tract? The corticospinal tract is exactly what its name suggests, a tract that carries information downwards from the cortex through the spinal cord. Let's start by talking about what kind of information this tract carries. We're not alone down here in the deep. In fact, the coral spine has attracted quite a few visitors, including a deep-sea explorer in the motorized submarine here. Yep, just take a look at this capsule submarine, driven by the motor in the back. By the way, the motor here should remind you of motor information. Get it? A motor for motor information? This is to remind you that the corticospinal tract is a motor tract, carrying motor information downwards from our brain to the muscles of our body. This is also why the tract is referred to as a descending tract, since the motor information needs to descend downwards from our brain to reach the muscles below. But it looks like the explorer here was pretty spooked out by this giant spine at the bottom of the sea. Yep, just take a look at him trying to steer away from the coral spine here. As he turns the steering wheel one way, the rudder of his capsule submarine turns the other direction in order to make the steering happen. If you've ever driven a submarine, or a boat for that matter, you'd know that the rudder always points in the opposite direction of where you're trying to steer. By the way, this opposite movement should remind you of the fact that the corticospinal tract mediates movement of limbs on the opposite or contralateral side of the body. We'll go into more detail later when we cover the decussation of this tract. But for now, just know that the motor impulses from the brain start by directing movement of the muscles on the opposite side of the body. With the function out of the way, we're going to talk about the specific anatomical journey that this neural tract takes from the brain to reach the muscles. This path involves two neurons, which we'll talk about in order. Now, let's focus more on the capsule submarine at the top or upper half of this scene. This upper submarine near the top of our scene should remind you of the upper motor neuron, the first neuron in the corticospinal tract. Inside of the capsule submarine, we can see the computer that controls the motor. Yep, you can even see the core CPU sticker on this machine. By the way, the core here should remind you of the cortex. You know, core for cortex. And the cortex of the brain kind of works like a CPU for the rest of your body, right? Anyway, the core CPU controlling the motor of this submarine should remind you that the corticospinal pathway starts in the primary motor cortex of the brain. This is the part of the frontal lobe in front of the central fissure. This is the main motor area of the brain. All motor impulses to our muscles originate from neurons in this part of the cortex. Next, take a look at the back limb of this capsule submarine. The arm extending behind the submarine should remind you of the posterior limb. You know, since an arm is another word for a limb. And the arm extending backwards, or posteriorly, should remind you of the posterior limb. The posterior limb of this capsule submarine should remind you of the posterior limb of the internal capsule, or a structure through which the motor fibers from the primary motor cortex will pass through next on their descent from the brain. If you don't remember, the internal capsule is a boomerang-shaped structure in the inner and middle part of each cerebral hemisphere, where nerve fibers pass through to connect to the upper cortex. Since the internal capsule is shaped like a boomerang on horizontal sections, it has a front half and a back half. The descending fibers of the corticospinal tract pass through the back or posterior half, also called the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Next, notice the cereal dispenser inside of the submarine? Always gotta have a snack ready when you're exploring the deep, right? The cereal dispenser here raises the cereal on a pedestal, making it a cereal pedestal, right? By the way, the cereal pedestal should help you remember the cerebral peduncle. You know, since cereal sounds like cerebral and pedestal sounds like peduncle. After passing through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, the fibers of the corticospinal tract continue downward through the cerebral peduncle to reach the brainstem. Anatomically, this is just the connection between the cerebrum above and the brainstem below. And since these are descending tracts, it should make sense that the corticospinal fibers have to go through the cerebral peduncle, right? So what happens after the fibers reach the brainstem? Well, take a look back at our submarine driver here, who seems to be a decorated Navy sailor. Yep, you can even see those two crossing medals over his chest. The crossing medals here should remind you that the corticospinal tract decussates or crosses over to the other side in the medulla of the brainstem. Get it? Since a medal is our recurring symbol for the medulla, the crossing over of these medals should remind you of the crossing over of nerve fibers in the medulla. As we mentioned above, the nerve impulses in the primary motor cortex actually control the muscle movements of the opposite side of the body. That is, the right brain controls the movement of muscles on the left side and vice versa. This means that at some point, the nerve fibers need to cross over to get to the other side. For the corticospinal tract, it is important to remember that this crossing over, or decussation, happens in the medulla. Technically, this occurs at the caudal medulla, at a side called the pyramid, which is why this decussation is also referred to as the pyramidal decussation. That said, I think you should just remember that this decussation happens at the medulla, and you should be set for most questions on test day. After crossing over, the nerve fibers continue downwards to run in the spinal cord, where they form a bundle that is formally called the corticospinal tract, which we obviously represented using the coral spine here, remember? Anatomically, these fibers run in the lateral portion of the spinal cord, which is why the corticospinal tract is also referred to as the lateral corticospinal tract. This continues downwards until the nerve gets close to its point of exit from the spinal cord. At this point, we're going to shift to the lower part of this scene at the sea floor, which corresponds to the lower motor neuron of this pathway. While the upper motor neuron runs from the brain to the spinal cord, the lower motor neuron is responsible for carrying the motor impulses the rest of the way to the muscle. Connected to this coral-infested spine is a horn at the front of the whale. You know, since this must have been some sort of horned whale, which always have horns at the front of their head, right? This front horn should remind you of the anterior or ventral horn of the spinal cord, since anterior is just another way of describing the front, right? The lower motor neuron's cell body actually lives in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, which is a horn-shaped protrusion of gray matter located in the front of the spinal cord. This is where the fibers of the upper motor neuron synapse to transfer the information to the lower motor neuron. Finally, let's look over at our muscular diver here who is inspecting the anterior horn. Yep, he's developed a lot of muscles after years of doing so much deep-sea diving. By the way, the muscle here should remind you that the muscle is the final destination of the lower motor neurons. You see, after the motor impulse is passed to the anterior horn, nerve fibers from the anterior horns exit the spinal cord to reach the muscles they eventually innervate. Technically, these motor impulses are delivered to the neuromuscular junction, or NMJ, which translates the electrical signals from the nerve into contraction of the muscle. And that's it for the corticospinal tract. Let's summarize everything we've covered in this deep-sea adventure. The corticospinal tract, also known as the lateral corticospinal tract, or pyramidal tract, is a neural pathway that carries motor information downwards from the brain through the spinal cord to eventually reach the muscles of our body below. In this way, the corticospinal tract primarily functions to voluntarily control the muscles of the limbs on the contralateral or opposite side of the body. Anatomically, this nerve tract is separated into two neurons, the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron's cell body resides in the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe of the brain. This neuron sends fibers downwards through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, then through the cerebral peduncle to reach the brainstem. In the brainstem, these fibers decussate or cross to the opposite side of the body in the medulla before continuing downwards into the spinal cord as the lateral corticospinal tract. The upper motor neuron ends in a synapse in the anterior horns of the spinal cord. This is where the cell body of the lower motor neuron resides. The nerve fibers of the lower motor neuron then exit the spinal cord to reach the muscles they innervate. They do this by synapsing at the neuromuscular junction, which induces muscle contraction in response to nervous impulses. And that's it for the corticospinal tract. Neurology is really a lot less mysterious than the deep sea, don't you think? With this mnemonic in your head, I'm sure you'll have no problem staying afloat on the boards and the wards. I'll see you in the next one.